You are listening to the podcast of the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinec.hu/en.
Well, hello and welcome to the MCC podcast. I'm Luke Larson, visiting fellow here at the Matthias Corvinus Collegium. I'm joined today by Solène Tadié. She is the Europe correspondent for EWTN News, an American Catholic media agency, and is a regular contributor to the National Catholic Register newspaper. She is French and Swiss. She grew up in Paris and studied philosophy at the Angelicum in Rome and was a writer for the Vatican's L'Osservatore Romano newspaper. Solène, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Luke. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. So to begin, you've written a lot about the Catholic Church in Europe for an American audience. Tell me, in the Church today, in the Catholic Church today, what are the differences that you see between the United States and Europe?
Well, it's a tough question because there are so many different realities within the United States and then within Europe, from a country to another. What is clear, in the US, you have this multiculturalism that is even stronger than in Europe. And within the Catholic Church, you have like very strong extremes. You have even Catholic churches promoting LGBTQ rights, while you have also extremely conservative churches as well within the Catholic Church in the US. I would say it's a little bit less polarized in Europe. And then between countries like France, countries where the Catholic Church is usually very much attacked, where there is the most hostility, I would say. You have also the strongest Catholic movement, so it's the case for France. The reality is different than that of the US because it's more about the revolution, the revolutionary and the anti-clericalism culture that is pushing some Catholic communities to get stronger. So you have also, like in the US, very strong traditional communities like the trad Catholics. But you have also very strong charismatic communities in France. So I would say that in a country like France, you have those who are tendentially ashamed of their faith, but you don't have like this extreme progressivism that you see in the US. And on the other hand, you have very strong young Catholic communities, whether charismatic or trad, Yeah, they are a very small minority, and I think it's quite fascinating about reporting on Europe right now is to see all the different realities. Countries like Portugal or Poland, where a big majority of people are still Catholic, but they are tendentially less assertive in their faith because it's a cultural fact. It's a given for them still now, although the religious practice is also the numbers are plummeting as well in these countries like Poland and Portugal, although more than 80% of people are still self-declared Catholics. But it's a cultural practice. While in a country like France, there are a small minority, but they are stronger. And countries like Italy has suffered so much from COVID, from the beginning of COVID, and now in 2 years, they lost 20% of their regular churchgoers, 20% in 2 years, which is huge. So you see, you have very different realities. Then you have Northern Europe. Maybe we'll discuss that also later. It's the topic I love to report on. Countries like Sweden or Norway, who used to be at the forefront of dechristianization, but the advance of progressivism is somehow encouraging young people who were not Catholic originally. They grew up in the Protestant culture, and they are willing to go back to their Christian faith because of the surrounding craziness that they're seeing. They really need moral landmark, and they want to go back to their Christian roots, but they tend to do that, to go to the Catholic Church instead, because in their countries, the church leaders are less progressive. They tend to be more standing their grounds in the face of, all the current trends. So it's a very fascinating movement, also because there are a lot of priests there are Polish. Maybe that's also one of the reasons. But it's very interesting to see in countries like Norway or Sweden, also because of immigration. But overall, Catholicism is the religion that is growing the most, and trad Catholicism. So, you see in these countries where progressivism is very active, you have this kind of phenomenon. So it's quite fascinating.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I notice, living here in Hungary and talking to young Catholics, sometimes I ask them, where do you get your formation in the faith? Or where did your conversion come from? Or, where do you learn about the faith? And so often they'll say, well, from Father Mike Schmitz, or from the Pints with Aquinas podcast, or Trent Horn, or Bishop Barron, these American figures. Do you notice that as well throughout Europe, that the American Catholic Church is having a big influence in Europe?
It's really something I noticed in Hungary, indeed, or in Central Europe. I wouldn't say it is the case in countries like Italy or France, because we tend to have a very strong culture. So we tend to rely on our own, church leaders. And there is also the language barrier, because tendentially in countries like Germany or Central Europe, they are more open to the Anglo-Saxon world, which is not necessarily the case elsewhere. But it's true, especially it's specifically true for the conservative world. Young people are relying on the role models coming from the US, because they have, they are unapologetic about their faith, and it's very inspiring for a lot of people. So yeah, it's a very widespread phenomenon, more on Eastern or Central Europe, that's for sure. A little bit less in the Latin countries, but it is something, yes. Yeah, there is a fascination for characters like Bishop Barron, for instance, and there is this deep thirst for moral landmark. And that's something that we're witnessing everywhere, although it's taking different forms. But yeah, it's definitely something that's going on.
Mm-hmm. How would you characterize the American Catholic Church today? What are its strengths and its weaknesses?
So again, what I say, the fact that it's so polarized, I would say it's a weakness. The things we see, like in Chicago, last time I visited Chicago, I would see a church with an LGBT flag outside, or it's really not something you would see in a country like France, although, anti-clericalism is very present, but you would never see such a thing in any other country. I'm traveling all across Europe for my job, and I don't see these kinds of things happening. So in the US, you always have, the worst and the best, in a sense. So you have very, very strong intellectuals. And to answer also your previous question, sometimes I'm interviewing young Catholic influencers in France. And it's true that most of the time their role models are American. Intellectuals, the pro-lifers are American. So that's for sure. Even in France, I forgot this aspect. Like from a few very strong intellectual in France are being influenced by the US, because your strength is that whenever you do something, you are unapologetic. And for the worst and for the best, that's for sure. So yeah, that's the strength of the US, is that you have very solid training most of the time. When you're Catholic, you are fully Catholic, and the weakness is that the polarization. Like you have this extremism in dissent, and that's probably the problem with the US. Everything is so strongly, like oppositions are creating all these divides within the society itself, which is not that strong in most European countries I visit.
Mm-hmm. It seems like in any discussion of religion today, kind of the underlying assumption is that it's in decline, or people tend to be very pessimistic, right? The mass attendance is going down, religious practice is going down. What do you think are the biggest challenges for the church today?
Speaking again about also one of the strengths of the American clergy overall, I had an interview with a French bishop who is known for his outspokenness. It's Bishop Hayet, is in the south of France. He told me, we bishops overall need to be like to bark like dogs, most because we are too silent and we are not involved in politics. We are not involved in the fields that really matter. Even now, like the future technologies, artificial intelligence, and somehow the US was a model for him because many priests are also involved in the political world. They really care about what's going on in the world. And now, the church doesn't have to follow the trends, but to understand what's going on and to also be able to know what's going on to evangelize through the current movements at play. It doesn't mean that you follow worldliness or that you just adapt to the world, but you follow what's going on. You really need to be able to understand and to speak the language of today with the same truth, the immutable truth, but with today's language. Otherwise, you're losing people. But, like traditional chants, like Gregorian chants are so attractive to so many young people. So you can, with like always the same traditional teachings, but with today's language to reach people's hearts and to talk to them directly. I interviewed a Polish politician recently. He's the marshal of the deputy marshal of the Polish parliament, and he said the problem with the church in Poland, that, for instance, most people are Catholics, but the problem is that many of them come from the communist generation and post-communist generation. And even the very good bishops, very good clergymen, they tend to talk to the youth with the language of, the Cold War or something like that. And it's not adapted to this generation anymore. It's very important for the church to know what's going on and to be able to talk about today's issues, with pornography, but in a very realistic way, and to really enter all these controversies also with artificial intelligence, to really know what's going on, not to be superficial about these things. We can't afford that right now. We really need to be a light to enlighten people. And in order to be able to do that, we need to really know what's going on. And our priests can't afford not to know what's going on with economics, with politics. They can't afford to stay outside. They really need to be involved in that.
Right. So it seems like there is really effective evangelization happening through media. You mentioned the strength of the small remnant of the faithful in France, the conversions back to Christianity in the Nordic countries. What are some other signs of hope for the church in Europe that you see?
I mentioned these northern countries, and I think that's something very interesting to follow, because countries like that who were completely de-Christianized, and they saw the outcome of their ideology and they know where it's taking you. And at some point they say, okay, we need to change direction because it didn't bring us anywhere. And so there is this growing awareness at the same time. And what I see is that there is a new generation coming. I see, I'm absolutely not in favor of clash of generations, like the boomers against the new generation, the millennials and all, because there are many great boomers who actually know what's going on. But it's true that you also have a new generation of bishops, the John Paul II generation, the Pope Benedict generation, who are now becoming young bishops. And that could change the landscape of the church in Europe. That could change a lot of things. You have all these young communities growing. You see something like the Chartres pilgrimage, where they basically have to close registration even more than 1 month before. And you have these... And
that's the annual traditional pilgrimage in France.
In Chartres, right? Every year, people even flocking from around the world. You have the same for charismatic young people like Paray-le-Monial. And it's growing everywhere. It's like they have to refuse people. There is another thing in France, again, but I think discussing France is very important because it shows it always announces what's going to happen in the coming years, because that's where Christianity is probably the more strongly attacked. In Lille, in northern France, I recently reported on that. You have Mass every Tuesday, almost every Tuesday, a candlelight Mass, completely in the dark, only with candlelight. to really show the beauty of the liturgy, to have really Christ at the center of everything. They gather every Tuesday in this very strong student city of Lille, 800 to 900 people every Tuesday. They have to refuse people now, at the entrance. So it's really something happening. All these super young people, they come there at 10 p.m. every Tuesday to praise the Lord, which is something completely crazy when we see the state of the French society. So of course you can only be hopeful, and then when you trust the Lord, you can only be optimistic. They started with 12 apples, there were just 12 at the beginning, and now, we are still billions. We are going through a deep crisis in Europe, but you already see all the seeds of the new faith, the renewal. So we should just cling to that and keep growing, and of course there are a lot of reasons to hope.
That's right. Christianity is very good at resurrection.
Exactly.
Before recording today, we were talking about how you encountered Pope Benedict's writings when you were in Rome and that he had a deep impact on your life. Can you talk about what he means for you and what his legacy is for the church?
Yeah, of course I have an endless respect for him. I think he really changed my life for the better. When I first moved to Rome, I was not a practicing Catholic. I've always felt very close to Christ my whole life. But during adolescence, like many young people, and especially in France, and especially in the world where I was evolving, I lost my Catholic faith, I would say. So I was a bit lost between the Protestants and the Catholics, and I was not so sure. I moved to Rome to be a journalist. I had no plan of working in the Catholic world at all. But I was hired, I would say by chance. So providentially, I was hired as a young student in 2012 as a translator for the Synod on New Evangelization. And I had to translate bishops' speeches as well as Pope Benedict's. And so that's how I first got acquainted with his thoughts. And I would say it changed my life, not immediately, but I first was so surprised by the depth of his thoughts and how it was so crystal clear. And it was so universal. Everyone was saying, I was influenced by the media as well. Oh, he's like, no one understands what he's saying, and he's just old-fashioned, and he talks to nobody. And it was so wrong, and I could see it with my very eyes, that it was so clear, it was so universal, so profound, so full of, love and humility and intelligence. And I felt so humbled when I first read his speeches, and I felt so honored to have the privilege to translate them in French. And that's how it started. And then providentially, in every job I had, like even as an intern, I was asked to dig into Pope Benedict's thoughts and write synthesis of his thought about his philosophy, about his theology. And that's always, I got so amazed and impressed at the depth of everything, like every single aspect of his thoughts. And then I realized how important he was. He was such a blessing. He was a God-given Pope for the Church because in the 1980s, he had the very difficult, a very delicate task of implementing the legacy of Vatican II, at the same time correcting all the crazy experiments. I don't want to be judgy, but like the weird experiments, everyone could agree on that, in the 70s, made by, these kind of new communities that were distancing themselves like very profoundly from the core teachings of the church. So he had this very difficult position. So some people call him God's Rottweiler, because he's like, he's like, with the doctrine of the faith, he's just like the new Inquisition. And some other people during Vatican II were calling him a progressive and saying that he was among those, responsible for the collapse of the church. And like, he was just a man of balance, trying to save all the core teaching of the tradition, but also try to see what new could come out of it for the world of the 60s. And so he really believed in Vatican II. But what he saw the results, the bad fruits, some of the bad fruits of Vatican II in his own flesh in Germany. And he really tried to correct that when he was with the doctrine of the faith. It really tried to to put a balance in the middle of that, to implement the best of Vatican II, and at the same time try to correct all the excesses that were going on around the world. So he had a very important mission, very prophetic mission, and I think people will realize that, but over time, I think it's still too soon. Only those who really read everything about him, really followed his work for all these decades, can understand that. Most people still don't see that, but we will realize that over time in the coming decades, I think.
Mm-hmm. He was certainly a very prolific writer, and more than just a pope, a huge theologian.
Exactly.
Will probably be remembered throughout the history of the church. Is there a particular writing of his that really stands out to you?
So for me, what was life-changing, and again, I would mention an interview I had with Father Federico Lombardi, who was the spokesperson for the Vatican for many years during Pope Benedict's pontificate. And what I love about our conversation, he said, what the greatest service Pope Benedict did to the church was to actually to introduce the face, like Christ's face and his figure, to the modern world through his wonderful work of Jesus of Nazareth. He was it was an incredible work. He when he wrote it, he was already old and tired, but he gave so much of himself, all of his energy to write this book because he thought it was so important that the postmodern world know Christ, know who he is and how real he is and how current his teachings are. And he couldn't do any greater service to the church nowadays, and it also changed my life in a way, like to teach me how rational the faith is, how true Christ is, and what were his teachings, who was Christ, what he wanted us to be, and how modern and how it's completely out of time. And I think and I completely agree with Father Lombardi with the fact that his greatest service was to really make this new generation understand who Christ is and will ever be.
Mm-hmm. You've also come to know another prominent figure in the church during your work as a journalist here in Budapest. That would be Cardinal Péter Erdő. And you've interviewed him for several publications. He's obviously, his profile has risen in the church, it seems, in recent years, and is often listed as a papabile, or one of the most likely candidates to be the next pope. Can you give me a sense of who Cardinal Erdő is?
So first of all, I think the reason why he's becoming popular in different circles of the church is because of the idea of stability that he has. He's because of the balance. He grew up, he knows what it means to suffer for one's faith. He grew up in communist Hungary. His parents, like he mentioned several times in our interview, his parents were strong Catholics, so he grew up in a Catholic context, but his parents basically couldn't work because of their Catholic faith. So they had to grow up in a very difficult material situation. He was quite poor. His parents couldn't, his father was a jurist just like him. He's a canon law expert, but his father was a jurist already. He was not able to work in his own fields because of his Catholic faith. So he really knows, he learned in his own flesh when he was a kid what it means to suffer for one's faith. And I think it enables him to see the world for what it is. He's not into ideologies in general, so he could never be somehow locked up in any ideological group. Some people would say he's a conservative. Some other people would say, he's like more center, or some people would say he's more progressive because of, sometimes he really insists on mercy as well. I think you cannot put him into any category because he doesn't trust ideologies, because he grew up in like the purest ideologies of all, like socialist, like real socialism. And he doesn't like this kind of dynamics of like ideologies, like sides. He just wants to follow Christ. He's very stable, very balanced. He showed that during the Synod on Family. That's when he became well known to the international public because of his. He was never afraid to take public stances to protect the core teachings of the church, but at the same time, he was very open-minded. He would talk to everybody. He was never, closed in any way. So he was, he would always do that again with his legacy, where he knows what it's like when you close debates, when, ideas cannot be exchanged. And he's completely against that. So that makes him very open-minded. He wants to understand how people think, and he wants to listen to everybody, to deliberate. And that makes his strength. And that's why people, I think, in a time of crisis like ours, they say, one, since he's a brilliant canon lawyer, he would probably put some order into all the motu proprios that were issued in recent years. It would just bring some clarity, because that's what we lack right now, like clarity to understand where we're going, and balance. He never offend anybody. He always wants to understand people, and he's not a people pleaser either. If sometimes he can be also, he showed that during the Synod on the Family, when a decision must be made, he's not afraid of taking a strong decision either. But first, he wants to listen to everybody, to deliberate, and that for so many people right now, that's the kind of people they want, especially because of his post-communist background. He understands the big challenges of our time, the new ideologies, the danger of ideologies. He absolutely knows how to identify them.
As a Catholic, when I go to Rome, it feels like the center of the universe. And it's certainly the center of the Catholic Church. And it seems like it would make a lot of sense for the Europe correspondent of a large Catholic news organization to be based in Rome, as you were. But you're here in Budapest, and you have been for about 2 years now. Why did you choose to come here to Budapest? What makes this special to you?
I spent many years in Rome, actually 12 years. I studied there. I started reporting there first for a French media outlet, but then for the Vatican, for L'Osservatore Romano. I studied there, so I know Italy quite well. I know the realities of the field in Rome and of the Vatican quite well. And I'm covering Europe for the US. And I think, I know enough about Rome, I know enough about France, that is my country, to also explore other realities. And I think a lot is happening in this part of the world that most of the rest of the world is not aware of. What's happening in Hungary because of the language barrier. I think it's very important to be on the ground and to understand what's going on in Poland, it's what's going on in Hungary. Also because of this growing polarization within the EU. Since I'm super well acquainted with the challenges facing Western Europe, I wanted to get closer to a reality that was quite unknown to me. And Hungary could also have a prophetic role in the geopolitics, in the geopolitical world, for so many different things, whether you like Hungary, whether you like its orientations or not. It's fascinating to follow because it tells you where, the political world is going, the challenges, the controversies, and it helps you really understand the core of all these challenges. And so for me, it's quite fascinating, and to see also, many lies are being told against Hungary, and that's also what I'm seeing on the ground, being here, talking to people, talking to politicians from both sides, from the opposition, from the government. And many of the things we believe outside Hungary are completely untrue. And so that's, I'm just trying to bring some clarity about whatever happens in Europe. So that's pretty much a good start, like when reporting about Europe. But that doesn't prevent me from still following very closely what's going on elsewhere and to keep traveling a lot to other countries.
I think one of the most interesting topics that you've written about is feminism and the role of women and how that has played out historically. in Christian Europe. Obviously, gender and the dynamics between men and women is a huge controversial topic today throughout the West. And you've made the argument that the church has been not an oppressor of women, as we often hear in mainstream discourse today, but actually has really lifted women up more than any other institution in the West. Talk to me a little bit about that, about how what the church's role has been in women's lives and status.
I think it's a critical topic nowadays, especially because of the current state of the world and the crises within our societies and the crises in the relationships between men and women. And there are huge misunderstandings about the role of the church and spirituality, and a lot of women were lied to, and they believe that in order to be free, they just need to reject their faith, and they should just embrace some ideologies which I think are only damaging to them. And if you look at history, you see that the church of the first centuries were massively joined by women. There is a reason for that. Of course, in the US, you have this very famous figure, Rodney Stark, who is no longer, he passed away a few years ago. But in France, we have this very famous historian, Régine Pernoud, called Régine Pernoud. She wrote many books to show that. And she was a very strong female character, so even feminists could also, admire her. She received countless awards, even from the French Academy, and she was incredibly prolific. And she showed that, in the church of the first centuries, because before Christianity in the Greek or the Latin, like the pagan societies, women had no rights. Basically, they were not they were not a juridic person. They didn't have any legal status, so they were completely they depended completely on their father or husband or father-in-law. They had really no rights, and everything changed with the advance of Christianity and Christendom afterwards. So they were the first to join the church ranks, because from that point on, they were actually because of Saint Paul, and they gained a lot of rights, and they could choose to remain virgins. And when you see the history of the church of the first centuries, most saints, most martyrs were women. If you look at the list of all the saints of the church of the first centuries, they were all women, and women converted men. So that's how Christianity, could access to Europe. The world where we live in right now is all thanks to women in the church of the first centuries, because they evangelized men. They were pagan women converted to Christianity, and then they converted men from paganism to Christianity, and that's how we could Christianize our current world. So it's fascinating. And at the same time, there are many misunderstandings about the Middle Age. And again, Régine Pernoud wrote a lot about that. Other authors did, but I think Régine Pernoud did it so brilliantly. She explained a lot of dynamics in the feudal age, in the Middle Age, that also corresponded to a golden era for the church. We speak often about Europe that was covering up in a white mantle because of the cathedrals that were being built everywhere across Europe. That also corresponded to a period of time where women had, they could have basically every job they wanted. They could do basically every job. And they had, so many rights. If you look at history, they were completely free, and you see also manuscripts. You see like young nuns. Women would write manuscripts, and they would read more than men. And Régine Pernoud proved that. She has countless archives and sources showing that women were like extremely educated during the Middle Ages. It's completely untrue to say, it's like it was a dark era where, women were completely oppressed. It's just not true. They could do every job they wanted, every work they wanted. And they reached adult age even before boys, like 2 years before boys, actually, because they reached adulthood at the age of 12, and boys would reach adulthood at the age of 14. And it changed during the Renaissance period that corresponded to also a withdrawal of the Christian faith in the Western world. And that's when women started being banned from universities. That's when women lost, they reached adulthood only at 20, and boys could reach adulthood much before. So, we saw a shift at that period of time. And then during the so-called Enlightenment, like the Lumière and all, and Régine Pernoud shows that so clearly that women lost so much of their rights during this period of time that also corresponded to a loss of ground for the church, as well as the 19th century, the Napoleonic era, the Napoleon Code, the Napoleon law, civil code. Women were like eternal minors because of this code, and it corresponded also to complete loss of ground for the church at that time. And why would they expelled from, they couldn't vote, they were expelled from most clubs at that time. Why? Because of the revolution, and because most of them were so supportive of the clergy at that time, because they were so close to the church, and that's how they lost so much of their rights. And Régine Pernoud shows that so well. And so that's why I love to write about these things. It's so critical for our age to understand that, if you actually, history can be distorted, and you can basically use history to control minds and to, brainwash a lot of people. And when you go back to real facts and archives, you can understand so much of realities, and it can completely change your mindset. And there are so many unhealthy dynamics at play right now, and I think so many people would benefit from a healthy vision of the past, of the role of the church across history, including for liberating women across history. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I would agree that a lot of the discussion about men and women today is unhealthy. It's toxic. Do you see that secular discourse about men and women affecting discourse that happens in the church?
Of course, it's affecting every sphere of society. Even, the fact that this huge crisis in natality around the world, we are not making babies anymore, and we are becoming so weak. It's also a result of that. The whole crisis that we are facing right now is a result of that, of this crisis, this trust between men and women as well. And so that's why it's so critical for us, in our works, in journalism, in the political world, to try to, enlighten people and to just bring some truth to their analysis of the world. And it could change everything, actually.
Another interesting piece that you had this spring was about this trend of Muslims converting to Christianity, especially among those who come here to Europe as migrants, encounter Christianity and become Christians. Tell me a little bit more about that trend and what you think the future is of that.
That's another fascinating phenomenon. You see, there are many reasons to be hopeful and to be optimistic. Of course, there are many crises, and of course, the migrant crisis is so challenging. But in the midst of that, if you really look at all the dynamics at play, you see the world is quite fascinating. And so, yes, it's quite of a hidden phenomenon. But I've been interviewing a lot of people on the ground to understand what was going on with that, especially in a country like France, for instance, precisely because there is a huge Muslim community in France, but many, many of them are secretly converting to Christianity, hiding it to their parents, especially the new generations. And we have no figures, because of the very fact that it's forbidden in France to provide ethnic data or things like that. So and also because most of them do it secretly because they do it at great risk. Many of them get caught by their family and are sent back to their original countries, and there are, a lot of young women, for instance, disappear when their family found the Bible in their rooms, and they are sent to Morocco, for instance, Algeria, and they are forced to marry someone they don't love, a Muslim, so that they cannot embrace their Christian faith. So it's really something happening, and I've been fascinated by that, like trying to interview a lot of people. I interviewed some people who really made me cry because of their unbelievable testimony, like they dropped everything for their faith. I interviewed a very high-ranking woman coming from Algeria. She was working for the government in Algeria, so she had a very high position in the Algerian society. And she met Christ when visiting Europe just for a medical problem. And she met a Christian nun, and first it was a Christian nurse. That was the starting point, who was so kind to her. And then she encountered also religious figures, and she started reading the Bible in secret and everything. Back in Algeria, her family understood that. And then she became a widow, and they wanted her to marry, a very, we would say maybe a very strong Muslim to put her back on the right path for them. So she had to escape Algeria. So she had a big house, huge comfort, and she left everything. And she escaped. She said she was going to the hospital in Belgium because of a health issue. And then she disappeared with her 2 kids because she was fearing for their lives, and so she just escaped. And then she sought refuge in France. And so she found this wonderful Lebanese priest in France who is helping all those seeking to convert to Christianity in secret, and he helps hiding them as well. And so it's fascinating. And then I interviewed all these people from Indonesia, and they told me, Solène, you have no idea what's going on in these countries, Iran, Indonesia, because we have no figures. But it's huge. It's huge. You have so many of them, so tired of what's going on, of all this extremism across the planet in the Muslim world. They secretly are so attracted by the love and mercy that Christianity is offering. They are so thirsty of that, but they cannot, show it to the rest of the world. It's still secret. But I interviewed a guy who lives in Indonesia. He was a Christian first, then he converted to Islam, and then he wanted to go back to his Christian faith. And he has to hide in Indonesia because he says, if people realize that I'm leaving the Islam to go back to my Christian faith, it's very dangerous. But he told me, I'm far from being the only one who is doing that. They have some kind of hidden churches, and he says, I'm meeting guys whom I would have never told that they were converting to Christianity, because in the everyday life they appear to be very good Muslims and actually are converting to Christianity. So it's quite fascinating. It's really something that I really want to report on in the future, because it's happening under our very, very eyes, and we have no idea what's going on, and it's beautiful. Interesting.
How has the church responded to this? Have there been efforts to reach out to Muslims? Have there been efforts to welcome them into the church? Is it unknown at this point?
That's a big problem, and that's also one of the reasons why the Catholic Church is losing ground to the benefits of evangelical churches, because most of the time evangelical churches are much more aggressive from that perspective, so they reach out to these people much more than us. And I also spoke to a lot of people. I went to the Middle East several times, and I went to the Holy Land, and I spoke to young Arabs coming from the Muslim world seeking assistance from priests because they wanted to get baptized, and they told me they got rejected by Catholic priests because they were afraid of the consequences, and they were like, no, your Muslim faith is great, you don't need to receive the baptism, and they actually send them away, because they fear the consequences of welcoming them. They don't want to get hurt by Muslim proponent, and the same is happening in France. I investigated on the ground and interviewed a lot of people, and they tell me they had to create a special service, Anani. It's called Anani, because for many Muslims, when ex-Muslim wanting to receive the baptism, they just try to reach out to these Christian churches, and the Christian faithful, they are kind to them. They say, "No, your Muslim faith is perfect. You should just stay as a Muslim." And for them, they are so disgusted at what they see that they leave the church. So they end up becoming atheists eventually, or reaching out to evangelical Christians because they are not welcome within the Catholic Church. And it is really something we need to work on as well.
One last question before we close. I'm just curious to hear from you. What do you think are some stories or trends on the horizon in the church that you think will be growing in importance going forward? Maybe things that you've heard about or things that you're looking at.
There are many dynamics at play. So, of course, one thing I mentioned is the rise of this kind of trad or charismatic communities, this deep search for beauty and meaning across Europe. So it's starting in countries like Northern Europe, France. But I'm curious also about the consequences it might have with the Vatican right now. The Vatican has been quite harsh towards, not that much towards charismatic communities, but most towards trad communities. And there is some kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but many trad communities are like very strong in their stance. And, I'm a bit worried also for the unity of the church. But it's definitely something that will have many developments in the future. I'm 100% sure about that. So it's definitely something I'm trying to monitor on a daily basis. Then, of course, the huge challenges on the geopolitics for the world. The church will have a voice, the diplomacy of the Catholic Church, I think, will have a very strong role to play. So it's also something I'm following closely. And then the big challenges represented by new technologies, by artificial intelligence. I think the church is slowly starting to understand that, we need to get involved in that. So things are slowly starting being done. And I think, things will happen. So it's also something I'm following closely. And I think I will be reporting on that quite often in the future.
Mm-hmm. Solène Tadié, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much, Luke. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this MCC podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinac.hu/en.